Welcome back. In segment 2 today, when we're talking about defining and perceiving disabilities, I want to talk about the idea of disability as what's called a social construct. And what that means is that disability really is what you make of it. How do you look at it? Do you look at it as something that's a punishment? Do you look at it as something that's a medical issue? Or do you look at it as something that's a normal aspect of life? Well, we'll talk about each of those kinds of perspectives because it does make a difference in terms of how you think about yourself as well as your interactions with others. The first thing we'll talk about is the idea of the legal definition of disability. And when we think of the legal definition of disability, what we're talking about there is, at least within the United States, the idea of disability as a condition that, say, limits functioning. It's not like we have this whole list of things that, absolutely everything is a disability or things are not, but it's a way of looking at disability that says, what is the functional limitation on that person's life? And in particular, what are the limitations as far as what's called activities of daily living, the bathing, the dressing, the transportation, money management, and so on and so forth. So when we think about the legal definition, that's one of the main issues that's considered. Given that kind of definition, the World Health Organization and others have estimated that the prevalence rate of disability runs about 15% of the population. I would suspect that's probably a minimum estimate, but nonetheless, we're looking at between 1 and 2 out of 20 people would have a disability. One of the things that we know certainly is that there are more people with disabilities now than ever before. And when I tell students that, sometimes they're surprised by that it seems counterintuitive that with all the increases in medical technology, all the advances we've made in nutrition and so on and so forth, that surely there would be fewer people because we've had better technology, better education, certainly trauma services have improved, that we see an increase in the prevalence of disability. But do understand that when we talk about prevalence of disability, it's not something that's likely to go down. The more advanced we get, the greater likelihood that people will be saved and will live longer, and yet live longer with disabilities. We see that certainly a lot in servicemen and women who are returning from conflict. There's a concept, give you an example of why we'll see, I think, more people with disabilities than less, is in the military we talk about something called the death to disablement ratio. And that is exactly as it sounds. How many people come back with disabilities versus how many die? If you look at the figures in World War II, for every 4 soldiers who were injured, 1 died. In our current conflict, because of, again, better technology, better armor, better protection, so on and so forth, we have 16 to 1 is the death to disablement ratio. So there are 16 people who are injured to every 1 who dies. So I mentioned that simply as a kind of an interesting kind of factoid, but also with the idea that we will continue to see the population of people with disabilities increase, I think, rather than decrease. The other thing as we think about disability is it's a group you can join at any time, which is a startling thing to think about as you consider it. I'm standing here today talking to you and we're considering disability, but there's nothing that says I won't go out, drive my car and be in an accident and tomorrow have quadriplegia, or to be in an accident and become blinded, or to lose my hearing. There's a variety of things that could happen, which is, I think, one of the reasons when we talk about stereotypes and attitudes, that people are somewhat uncomfortable about disability because, again, it's a group that we can join at any time, and yet when we think of the joining it, most of us don't think about that as, oh, I can't wait, I want to be part of that group. We look at it with some fear and some trepidation. The other fact that we know about disability is, if you think about it, the older you get, the greater the likelihood of having disability, right? My mother right now, God bless her soul, is 92 years old, and she has health problems. She would be considered having some disabilities. She and the other people who live in her area, they're all very similar. So yes, the older you are, the greater the likelihood. On the other hand, from a demographic standpoint, there's a lot more people who are under 65 than over 65. So the total number of people with disabilities is much larger in the general population, not just for seniors. When we think about disabilities' impact on a personal level, there's a number of ways in which it greatly varies among people. So there's no one single disability experience, if you will. Think about it in terms of money. People with more money have more access. People with less money have less access to healthcare, education, greater incidence of disability. Access to money alone is a huge factor in how one deals with or doesn't deal with disability. Well, I can certainly give you facts and figures about the money and finances that people with disability may face. I think it might even be more impactful to hear a brief statement from Sheila as she talks about some of the needs that she might want but may not have the money for.
And so they may say things like, you should. I saw this thing the other day, and it was a table that you can lock yourself into, and you can do a lot of things. You should think about getting those. You have people that are always going to come to you with things that that can improve your life. As far as for people with a disability, but little do they know, those things cost. And those things are 90% of the time not included for insurances. So you have to have money in order to do that. And so it's best not to just to offer that little bit of information, because more than likely they already know about it. They know about it. Mm-hmm.
Gender is another issue. We know that there are more males than females who have disability. That's just how it works in that regard. But women, just like in the general society, find a significant number of disadvantages based on sexual discrimination as well as disability discrimination. So employment issues, social role issues at home, things are oftentimes more difficult for women than men in that regard. Employment figures are also another area where we look at and see big disparities between people with disabilities and without. Estimates vary on this, so I have several things that you can look into as far as resources for this lesson, but estimates would say up to 70% of of people with disabilities are unemployed, that you've got huge issues of opportunity and barriers that exist. In fact, we have a later lesson where we'll talk more specifically on employment issues, because I think that is one of those areas that is particularly problematic for a lot of people with disabilities. There are many barriers to being hired, maintaining your status as an employee, as well as being promoted. So we'll address some of those a little bit later. If you're a person with a disability, by and large, you often have lesser opportunities to access health care and education than people without. My brother David, I'll tell you many stories about David. He came to live with me several years ago. Came with no job, no money, no health insurance. And despite all of my background, all of my knowledge, it took us months to get all those things set up for him. And his ability to access health care via Medicaid was something that I had no idea what a challenge it was, and kind of the quality of some of the services received. So when we think about that, the money and power has a huge impact in terms of how disability affects the person. And the final thing I would say on this too is family makes a difference. Family and professional supports. The tighter your family is, the more support you get from them, the greater access you have to professionals. Again, it tends to lessen the impact of the disability, or at the very least, helps you come to grips with how best to make your life good with it. Certainly one of the most important things when we think about family and professional support is, within your own nuclear family, within your own home, what kind of supports do you get? How does the family respond to you? I think one of the best tributes I heard when talking to students and developing this project was something from Alex, and I'll let him tell you about how very important the support he got from his family, and his mother in specific, was to him as he's made this journey.
Some of the most important things in my life, family is really important. My mom is really important. I know when I was growing up, just after I was born, I got diagnosed with CP, cerebral palsy, and doctors were saying to put me in a home, that I would never walk at all. But my mom, said, no, he's got home. It's me, I'm going to take care of him. And she took care of me, and I really appreciate that. And she's went through a lot for me. So my mom, just to make sure that I can participate with everyone else as much as she can. I remember when I was in elementary school, there were a lot of issues. The school wasn't very accessible, let's put it that way, and I couldn't use the bathroom comfortably because it wasn't accessible. There wasn't a bar in the toilet, and my mom had even offered to put a bar in there. She said, I'll pay for it and have someone install it. And the school still said no. And I couldn't I couldn't get up to the water fountain to get a drink. I had to get help from the teacher's aide just to do that. And so after the school had told my mom that they weren't going to allow her to put a bar in the bathroom, she got pretty upset, and so she wrote a letter to the civil rights office in Chicago, and they came down there and found all these violations, and they were happy that she called, and that was a good experience, and I got a bar in the bathroom, and I was able to go to the bathroom. So, yeah, I think advocacy is important.
So I think that offers us a pretty interesting perspective on how somebody looks at their life and disability and sees it as having some positive growth potential. So as we end this particular segment, I do want to summarize the idea that, first off, as we think about disability, remember that it's not just the legal definition, that it's a social construct, so that how we each interpret it, how we each experience it, really does vary based on a variety of circumstances that we'll explore later on in this lesson. Particularly, we looked at the idea that there's the legal definition, there's the idea of how the individual looks at it, and also as well as how does society look at it. And we will follow up much more with that in the next segment in terms of how society perceives disability.